Hello and welcome to our third session on the rules of squash, um, effective from the 1st of September 2025. It's World Squash controlled, and we now have 14 in place of the previous 15 rules, and we have 6 appendices in place of the original 8. This session deals with rules 11 to 14, so that's the ball, conditions of play, a new rule, which is a combination of the old rule 12 on distraction, the old rule 13 on fallen object, and the addition of a third part on damp patches on the court. The old rule 14 on illness has become rule 13 and is now called illness, injury and blood injury in place of the previous title. And the old rule 15 becomes rule 14 on conduct. There have been 2 additions to that rule also. So rule 11 deals with the ball, and in the event that both players request that it be replaced, that's what has to happen. But in the event that it's only one player would like the ball change, it requires the agreement of the referee. When the ball breaks during a rally, a let is allowed, and then the ball is brought back up to playing temperature by the players warming it up. Similarly with other injury and other intervals. If the ball breaks, a let is allowed, but if the ball has appeared to break in the previous rally, a let will be allowed on that previous rally and the point replayed. The ball should remain on court at all times. And not that I've ever seen a ball wedge, but if a ball wedges between the front and side wall or between the side and back wall, a let is allowed. Similarly, if it touches any article on the floor, a let will be allowed, unless of course that article has fallen from the player, in which case the opponent will be allowed or will be awarded the point. There's no let for unusual bounces, you just have to take it as it comes. The professional ball, the pro ball, is the double dot, which surprisingly enough most people play with. And the so-called competition ball is the single dot ball, which in the Irish context at least would seem to be reserved for beginners or very cold court conditions, and certainly players at under 11 competition level are required to use the single dot ball. We know of course that professionals playing on the coloured glass courts will play with the white ball. As I said, rule 12 is a combination of the old rule 12 and 13. So the distraction, the 12.1 part, is the old unchanged rule on distraction. A player can appeal for distraction and a let will be allowed, but that appeal must be immediate. There's no point in waiting until the end of the rally and then, having lost that rally, requesting a let on some noise that may have occurred from a mobile phone going off at some crucial earlier stage. It's too late. You must stop immediately and look for your let for distraction. If the distraction is accidentally caused by the opponent, as could happen with a very loud noise from the opponent, or maybe the opponent falling, or the opponent's racket flying out onto the court somewhere, well, if accidentally caused, of course a let will be allowed, unless of course there's actual obstruction, in which case the decision may be a stroke to the player. But we're talking here about distraction particularly. If the opponent, of course, makes an effort to deliberately distract the player, well, then it's a stroke to the player. I recall in our club many years ago, we used to have a guy who'd stamp his foot just as you were trying to drop the ball. the reward, or if you like, the penalty for that nowadays would be a point awarded against that player. The distraction that's caused not by the opponent, so it could be that loud noise we're talking about, or some unexpected audience noise, or the arrival of some bee or hornet onto the court or something like that, well then a let will be allowed, unless the player has played a winner, in which case the opponent looking for, calling for a let, will get no let. Because of course, if the player is playing a winner, that would have been unaffected by the distraction. A note then to referees, in the interest of marketing our sport and making it a bit livelier, the old notion of requesting silence while the rally proceeds is dated. Distraction where caused by crowd enthusiasm, Rule 12.1.3 can be suspended and the referee should not ask for quietness. However, a let can still be allowed for loud or unexpected noises. That would be where the ambient or background noise is quite considerable, but even where that's the case, where there are lots of conversations going on and there's a lot of traffic of people passing by, even in those occasions where the background noise is considerable, a let can still be allowed if the noise was unexpected or particularly loud. You're unlikely to get silence in an environment like Central Station there. Rule 12 on objects falling to the court. Well, a fallen racket is part of the sport in squash. If a racket falls of itself, that's not going to result in a let unless it involves obstruction. And that would be a different scenario. Objects falling from a player, well, it's bad luck for the player because the referee should stop the rally and award the point to the opponent. That could happen with eye guards or contact lenses falling to the floor, or maybe if somebody's carrying a handkerchief, or maybe the string tensioner, if anything like that falls from the racket or the player, the referee will stop and award the stroke to the opponent. Objects falling from outside the court, well, if they remain unseen, the result of the rally stands, but it would be necessary for the marker stroke referee to stop the rally, have play a let and have the item removed. You're more likely to drop your mobile phone with your scoring app on it than you are to drop your old-fashioned marking or scoring sheet, and hopefully nobody will be dropping their pints of beer from the balcony. Court conditions, the third part of the rule. The first half of 12.3 is familiar enough ground in that most of the items covered were in the existing rules. 12.3.1, a change in conditions. It could be maybe that because of heat or lack of ventilation, the walls are weeping, the walls are wet, in which case the referee will stop the match and await an improvement in conditions. We've already seen objects falling on the court, and we'll see that in the event of illness and the player vomits, the court is rendered unplayable, and unfortunately for that ill player, the match must be awarded to his or her opponent because they've rendered the court unplayable. We'll deal with injury and blood in the relevant Rule 13. Obviously, they can affect playing court conditions as well, but we'll deal with them in due course. and the normal perspiration falling from players. Either player can request at the end of the rally that the court be serviced to make it safer. Notice what we're talking about here now is at the end of a rally. We're not talking about a player stopping during the rally. This comes in the second half of 12.3. If a player, while attempting to play the ball, has left a wet area on the court due to slipping, lunging, diving, or any part of their body touching the floor, then, now just before we look at it, what's involved here is that the damp patch on the court has been caused by the player's action. And we're not talking here about the normal perspiration. We're talking about how it has just been described there. The player themselves must play on. The player cannot ask for a let because they're the people who've wet the court. So the player must play on or concede the rally. However, the opponent may request a let before hitting the ball, and that let will be granted. If play continues, neither player can request a let for safety. In other words, the rally must be played out. And then if the referee believes that the wet patch has been caused deliberately to gain some advantage, as in the case of a player tiring and hoping to get their breath back during a court service interval, if the referee believes that it was caused deliberately, they must apply Rule 14, which would at the very least be a conduct warning and quite probably more, maybe a conduct stroke. The referee must decide if conditions are safe for play to continue. That's always the job of the referee, to ensure that, insofar as it's practicable, the playing environment is safe. And the referee may allow a let without a request having been made, stopping play if necessary for safety reasons. So if the referee, him or herself, is of the opinion that the court conditions now are dangerous because of the dampness on the floor, the referee can themselves stop play and look for court, stop play, rule that it's a let, and have the court serviced. And we move on to Rule 13, illness, injury, and blood injury. And any of the time allowed begins once the referee has determined what type of injury it is and that the injury is genuine. And recovery is allowed only at the time of the injury. And if that time happens to be at the end of a game, the time allowed will include the 2-minute interval between games. So let's look and see what it says. Illness. A player who suffers illness, or the new in red added in part, physical impediment. So a player who suffers an illness or physical impediment that does not involve an injury or blood injury, such as cramp, nausea, the newly added blister, or breathlessness or asthma, well, that player experiencing illness or physical impediment must either play on, and if they choose not to play on, they must concede the game in progress and take the 2-minute interval between games and be ready to play on then when time is called. Failure to do that will result in the match being awarded to the opponent. And then if the player is ill and it causes the player to vomit or some other reaction that makes the court unplayable, the match will be awarded to the opponent. Moving on then to injury, the referee must satisfy him or herself, and with the aid of medical staff if they're there, that it is indeed an injury. and must advise the players as to which category of injury is relevant. Now, if it's a recurrence of some injury sustained previously or earlier in the match, that should be treated the same as illness, not as an injury, and therefore there is no recovery time allowed. So pre-existing injuries flaring up during a match is treated not as an injury, but as an illness. And then we come to the up to 3 minute interval allowed for a self-inflicted injury, as when one goes over on an ankle or bangs into the wall or something. You have a maximum up to a maximum of 3 minutes in which to recover. If one can't then resume, you have to concede the game in progress and take the 2 minute interval between games, and then be ready to play on after that or concede the match. A contributed injury is the result of accidental action by both players, so it's the fault of neither. Each has contributed to it. The two players are involved, and the injured player is allowed up to a maximum of 15 minutes to recover. Failure to continue at that point will require the player to concede the game in progress, and then take the, again, 2 minute interval between games, and to be ready to recommence then when time is called, and failure to do so will result in the match being awarded to the opponent. So 3 minutes for self-inflicted, up to 3 minutes for self-inflicted, and up to 15 minutes for contributed. And I'll just note in passing that previously there was a further 15 minutes allowed at the discretion of the referee, but that no longer applies in the 2025 rules. We now go on to opponent-inflicted injury, where the rules distinguish between an injury inflicted accidentally by the opponent and then the one which would be inflicted by the opponent. Opponent inflicted as a result of either dangerous or deliberate play by the opponent. In the case of opponent accidentally inflicted injury, well, it is dangerous play, or maybe dangerous play, and Rule 14 has to be applied. But in addition to that, up to 15 minutes of recovery time is allowed the injured player. And if the player is unable to continue after the lapse of the 15 minutes, the match is awarded to the injured player. If it is deliberately caused by the opponent, or if it's a result of the opponent's dangerous play, if any recovery time is required, the match is awarded to the injured player. And of course, if no recovery time is required, but there was a deliberate or dangerous play on the part of the opponent, of course, Rule 14 must be applied, because it's unacceptable behaviour. We move then to blood injury. And we remind ourselves here that nowadays there must be a flow of blood that could be transmitted from one player to the other, or could be transmitted to the court, transferred from one player to the other, or drops to the floor. That is blood injury. And things like grazes and scrapes where there's no blood flow, and the appearance of blood through on bandages or through clothing, none of that is now deemed to be blood injury. And of course, it's always the responsibility of the player to cover any existing wounds before going on court. And once a blood injury occurs, the bleeding player, the injured player, must leave the court, and the referee must ensure that the injured player returns within the shortest possible time. Right, here is Jack Allen, confirming to himself that Jeff Power on the floor, Jonathan Power, is indeed bleeding. So the referee double checking that it is all is as it seems. Right. If somebody's pre-existing wound or cut happens to bleed, that's treated the same as illness, and the injured player must play on or concede the game in progress and take the 2-minute interval between games, and must be then ready to resume or concede the match. So a pre-existing wound that bleeds is treated in the same way as a pre-existing injury. It's treated as illness and there's no recovery time allowed. A self-inflicted blood injury, that's when you slap yourself with a racket or bash into the wall and some blood ensues, or you fall to the floor and it's a little more than a scrape if it's bleeding a little bit. Well, it's a self-inflicted blood injury and you've got up to 5 minutes, and you must then be ready to continue. Otherwise, you must concede the game in progress, take the interval and continue at the end of that interval or concede the match. And if that self-inflicted injury recurs, no further time is allowed to recover, and you play on, or you don't play on because it's a blood injury, and when you're bleeding you must leave the court. But if it's a recurrence of a self-inflicted blood injury, you have to concede the game in progress and take the interval and be ready to resume after that interval or concede the match. So it's very similar to illness. Similar but not the same. Contributed blood injury, where the two players are, where there's traffic on the court and maybe one player is trying to get out of the way and the other player is trying to play the ball, and unfortunately the player strikes the other player and maybe there's an injury there with the racket. Unfortunately that happens, and it will be treated unless the player had an excessive swing. It will be looked on as a contributed blood injury, and the player is allowed what's referred to as reasonable time to stop the blood and cover the wound. I mean, all wounds do stop bleeding eventually, and then they can be covered and the player must resume. What's a reasonable time will be also within the context of the competition. There could be extra time where there's a big time gap in the schedule, whereas if it's a very tight schedule, or if television is involved, or transport is involved and people must leave, well then those circumstances will affect what's determined as reasonable time. If a contributed blood injury recurs through no fault of either player or as a result of the action of both players, you get further reasonable time. However, in the event that it's due to the player's own action, if the wound opens because of the player's own action, the player has no further recovery time and must concede that game in progress and take the interval. If the injured player can't resume within the time allowed in all the above examples, the match must be awarded to the opponent. Now we have where the blood injury is caused by the opponent's accidental action. So I should have held my shot, didn't, and I nick my opponent on the head. If that's deemed accidental, it's not the fault of the opponent. It's my fault, but it was accidental. Rule 14 may be applied. Maybe I get a conduct warning, or maybe worse. But the injured player is allowed reasonable time to stop the blood flow and cover the wound. And what reasonable time, again, is up to the referee, who could be assisted by on-site medical people if they're there. And if the player cannot resume within that reasonable time, then the referee will award the match to the injured player. If the same blood injury recurs, in other words, if the wound opens again and bleeds, through no fault of either player or due to the action of both players, if the blood can't be stopped in a reasonable time, the referee will award a match to the injured player. So it's the same result here. If the bleeding cannot be stopped within a reasonable time, the match is awarded to the injured player. If the same blood injury recurs solely due to the action of the injured player, there's no further recovery time allowed, and you can see the game in progress. You take the interval and be ready to resume, and if you're not able to resume after the relevant interval, the referee must award the match to the opponent. And as with deliberate or dangerous play causing injury to an opponent, if it causes blood injury, the referee applies Rule 14 and will award the match to the injured player. This is the same conclusion as deliberate action or dangerous action by the player causing injury that didn't involve blood. It's the same outcome. Award the match to the injured player. In all the above, that's everything to do with blood injury. Where there's a stoppage of play, the court must be cleaned and blood-stained clothing replaced. As always, play can resume before the expiry of the maximum time allowed, but of course both players must be given reasonable time to prepare to resume play. So the referee's job there would really involve liaising between the players and keeping the uninjured player informed of what is going on, as well as the time that's allowed for the injured player. Communication would be important there, so that both players, when it comes to it, will be ready to go back on court. Of course, it is always the injured player's decision whether or not to resume play. Your job as a referee, or the referee's job, doesn't involve telling the player they must play on. The referee's job involves telling them what their options are, and the player decides they can or cannot resume play. And then once the player has made that decision, the referee applies the rule as appropriate. And we come finally to Rule 14. And Rule 14 needs to be read up on. The underlined pieces there in red are the changes brought about since September the 1st, 2025. But let's have a look at some of them. Players must comply with any tournament regulations additional to these rules. Maybe there are special clothing rules applicable to a club or country, and if so, then these must be applied. Players may not place any object within the court. Especially in club games, you might find that the player wants to bring their wallet onto the court for safekeeping. So they bring their racket and their racket cover onto the court. Well, as referee, you can offer to mind it if you wish, but basically they can't bring these things on the court because they're potential hazard. Maybe the habit is growing whereby players bring their towels onto the court. It's best to discourage this practice because very often those towels are very big and they can interfere with the play. The perfect solution, of course, is where you have a container for the towels, separate containers for each of the two players' towels that can be kept up by the tin, preferably the same color as the tin. And then the use of those towels would be regulated during the match. Failing that, really, you're better off getting the players to leave their towels off the court. Players may not leave the court during a game without permission of the referee. I recall seeing one year in the Irish Open a player whose string had broken without any permission from the referee, running off court to opening the door, leaving the court, grabbing the racket and running back on again. And unfortunately, it was match ball, and their failure to get permission of the referee resulted in a conduct stroke, thereby costing them the match. Players may not request a change of any official. That comes as news occasionally to players that you would expect would be more experienced. Players must not behave in a manner that's unfair. Pay particular attention to that during the warm-up. Remember, in relation to Rule 4, the warm-up must be fair, must equal opportunity to both players to play the ball. Hitting the ball back to yourself 5, 6, 7, 8 times is unfair, and the referee should rule accordingly. Dangerous, abusive, offensive, or in any way detrimental to the sport. Of course, dangerous or abusive or offensive behaviour on the court, which is detrimental to the sport, players mustn't behave that way. Now, there is a list of 11 items here, or behaviours here, that are deemed by Rule 14 under 14.6 to be unacceptable behaviour, and the referee is required to penalise that behaviour, stopping play if necessary. So this isn't an option in the rules. Audible or visible obscenity. Audible is where they're swearing out loud. It may be the diplomatic thing to do to ignore the murmured obscenity. It's not audible. If it's audible, it must be penalised. And rude gestures, that's visible obscenity, that must be penalised also. Verbal, physical, or any other form of abuse to whomever, or opponent, referee, spectators, that must be penalised. Unnecessary physical contact, including pushing off the opponent. It's meant to be a non-contact sport. So we'll carry on with the list in a moment, but the point here is the referee must penalise the player, and that penalty can be at the least a conduct warning, or could be a conduct stroke if it was very bad, or repeated. It might even be a conduct game, and in extreme cases a conduct match. We saw there in deliberately injuring your opponent, that's automatically a conduct match. Now, deliberate or dangerous play. Running into a player who has played a drop when you could have stopped and looked for a let, but barging into the player, that is dangerous play. Maybe the person didn't intend it, but they didn't stop and they ran into their opponent. Hence, therefore it's dangerous play. Dangerous play now includes, or has always included, excessive racket swing, and now includes turning. Turning could be deemed to be dangerous play, and that would result in it requiring a penalty. Dissent to an official. Well, we know dissent, it's discouraged, and recent World Squash officiating directives have, reminded referees and players that dissent is to be penalised. The new one, 1466. Attempting to influence the referee. I say it's new because it's now made explicit. It's written down there that an attempt to influence the referee is looked on as unacceptable behaviour, and unacceptable behaviour must be penalised. So what that means is that hopefully the habit of one or other of the players trying to convince the referee that it's a stroke or that it's a no-let, hopefully the days of that behaviour will be numbered, because what should happen is that once an appeal is made, the referee then makes a decision and may, at the request of the players or on their own volition, decide to give an explanation, a brief explanation. But the idea that player A looks for a let and player B is immediately shouting at the referee how it's no let, or how player A is, stressing how much a stroke it is. These are blatant attempts to influence the referee, and it's there on the list. It's unacceptable behaviour, and 14.6 says unacceptable behaviour must be penalised. Unfair warm-up, abuse of equipment, that would be where you're slapping the floor or the wall with your racket in frustration. It would also apply where players will strike themselves with the racket, a practice that is best discouraged, and what better way to discourage it than to treat it as unacceptable behaviour and penalise it. Unfair warm-up, mentioned earlier. Delaying play, including being laid back on court. Delaying play during would be where you'd be taking too long to serve, for example. We all know the old trick of where the opponent passes you the ball and then it happens to touch your toe and then goes up to the top of the court, where you have to walk all the way up to pick it up and walk all the way back again. That's all time wasting and should be penalised. Being laid back on court, well, the times allowed are what they are, and within 15 seconds of the time expiring, the referee will call 15 seconds, and it's the job of the player to be back on court when the referee calls time. Deliberate distraction, we've met that earlier. Occasionally you may find that a player's method of appealing or bringing the attention of the referee to the fact that they are going to appeal a particular pickup or out of court shot later on. Really those hand gestures need to be such that they're not going to distract the opponent. Receiving coaching during play. It's the player will be cautioned and penalised for any coaching that's being put their way outside of the intervals. So a player guilty of an offence may be given a conduct warning or penalised with a conduct stroke, a conduct game, or a conduct match, depending on the severity of the offence. It's important to remember that just because you've given a conduct warning doesn't mean that for a repeat of that offence you must immediately escalate it to a conduct stroke. You don't have to. You can give another conduct warning. Clearly, giving too many conduct warnings for the same thing isn't having the desired effect. So at some early stage, the referee needs to escalate it from a conduct warning to a conduct stroke. The important thing is that you don't have to escalate it, but you can't take a step down. What I mean by what that means there is that providing any such penalty may not be less severe than the previous penalty for the same offence. So that the problem there is once you have awarded a conduct stroke for audible obscenity, for example. A repeat offence of the same, you can't go back and say conduct warning. Unfortunately, it has to be a conduct stroke again, at least. Interestingly, a warning or penalty can be imposed by the referee at any time, including during the warm-up and following the conclusion of the match. And then Rule 14.10 explains that if the referee stops play to issue a conduct warning, a let is allowed. If the referee stops play to award a conduct stroke, that conduct stroke becomes the result of the rally. If the referee awards a conduct stroke after a rally has finished, the result of the rally stands and the conduct stroke is added to the score with no change of service box. If the referee awards a conduct game, that game is the one in progress, or the next one if a game is not in progress, in other words, if you're during the interval. And there would be no additional 2 minutes allowed in that circumstance. If the referee awards a conduct game or a conduct match, the offending player retains all points or games already won. And then if you've had to implement or impose a conduct penalty, the poor referee has to complete whatever documentation is relevant. Conduct strokes and conduct games that happen on the European circuit, for example, or in junior, senior, or masters tournaments, can be complained to the tournament referee, who in turn may pass it on to the national federation, who then will get on to the governing body of the offending player, who in turn will get on to their poor referee and secretary, who in turn will get back onto the player and advise them as to how that it would be important that such a repetition wouldn't occur within the next 12 months, because if that were to be the case, the subsequent penalty would be more severe.